All right, everybody, hello and welcome. It's the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn on my webcam here so I can say hello and introduce myself. Hi there. This is the online webinar AAC Ready, Set, Goal, Part 1. It's about goal writing considerations for people who use AAC. And Part 2 will be tomorrow at the same time, 9 a.m. Pacific for us on the West Coast and 12 p.m. Eastern. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my webcam off so you can focus on the slides from here on out. All right. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items to cover. The control panel will look similar to one of these versions. It'll depend on if you're using the desktop view for Windows or Mac, or if you're using the web version. In the desktop version, you'll have the option to shrink and expand the control panel by using that orange arrow. Everyone is muted for the presentation, but go ahead and use the chat window to ask any questions that come up along the way. Kim will be helping to monitor those questions, and she'll let me know if I need to address any as we're moving along. There's also going to be several polls throughout this training. You'll find materials for this session in the materials section of the control panel. They'll also be included in the follow-up email after this session. So go ahead and download the handout packet if you haven't already. You're going to want that for the presentation because there's lots of opportunities to take notes and follow along with it. Please submit your participation form for ASHA within 15 days of your attendance today if you're hoping to receive ASHA credit. You can include the date of the training on that form, and that's how the training attendance is verified and recorded in our system. Your entrance and exit of the training is time-stamped through GoToTraining. So you have to stay online for the entire training in order to receive that ASHA credit. And then a little note about documentation. Don't forget to fill in that completion date. That's the important part that'll help us keep track of who is here. And again, you'll want to download the handout packet in your materials section. You'll notice that you don't have a copy of the PowerPoint slides for today. Instead, we've given you a very comprehensive packet of resources with the hope that you'll be able to use this to create some meaningful goals today and in the future that will be as individualized as your clients are. Note also the icon in the top right-hand corner. This is going to be used throughout the training to help keep you organized between the handout packet and the PowerPoint presentation. While we'll be discussing goal writing for AAC in general, I want to share that the products, the apps, and the communication boards featured are exclusively from Saltillo. I also want to share that I am a PRC Saltillo employee owner, and my non-financial disclosures are that I'm a WISLA member here in Washington, an ASHA member, and an ASHA SIG 12 member. Okay, so here's our first poll. I would love to hear who's here with us today. Are you a teacher, a parent, an SLP? And while I wait for those results, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I live in the greater Seattle area. I'm a speech pathologist, and I joined PRC Saltillo in March of last year. Prior to that, I worked in a pediatric outpatient clinic and in a pediatric rehab hospital where I served on a multidisciplinary AAC eval and implementation team. And now I get to serve our communities as a Saltillo AAC consultant in Washington and Oregon. All right, thanks everybody. So it looks like we have lots of SLPs, paraprofessionals, AAC consultants, wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming. As a consultant, one of my roles includes meeting with teams and providing coaching about AAC implementation after a client receives a device. And I often get questions like, do you know of a good AAC goal bank? Or we've tackled this skill, what should we target next? Or what does a good AAC goal look like? So we wanted to give people resources, ideas, and a place to start. We really want to provide people with a framework for thinking about goals, a way to think through how to craft a meaningful goal for someone who uses AAC. As most of you know, and probably why you're here today, creating goals and objectives for someone who uses AAC can be challenging, and these are some of the reasons why. Could be that we just don't know enough about the AAC system, or that language learning is different for people who use AAC, or there's lots of different things to work on and it's hard to prioritize which are the most important at any given time. Or it could be that change and progress is subtle and hard to measure, or that we always need to be considering the environment and communication partners. So Kim is going to launch our second poll because I would love to hear, what is your greatest challenge with writing goals for AAC? Is it that you don't know enough about the AAC system? Is it that language learning is different for people who use AAC? That changes and progress may be subtle or hard to measure? Or is it that you need to consider the environment and partners? Or if it's something else, go ahead and type it in the chat window so we can see it there. All right, it looks like a lot of it's that we just don't know enough about the AAC system, and that changes and progress can be really subtle. These are all great points, and we're going to talk a little bit about these reasons as we go. And we have one more. It's a combination of factors, mainly the need to consider different environments and partners of the student, and that changes are hard to measure, for sure. A lot of times it can be multiple reasons, right? So we have all these different factors to consider, and it just makes the goal writing process unique for these individuals. Okay, so these reasons, this is what led us to create this training. And here are the topics we're going to unpack today. For part one, we're going to go through understanding the AAC goal framework. I'll introduce a case study that we have sample goals and objectives for. The framework is heavily based in the communicative competencies. So today we'll be reviewing linguistic and operational competence. And then tomorrow we'll review social and strategic competence, as well as making goals SMART and monitoring progress. Jane Corsten is an SLP who created Every Move Counts, which is a program for building communication in individuals with significant sensory motor difficulties. And in her workshop, she asked the question, why do we write goals for people to do something they cannot do to get something they do not want? And this resonates with some of the situations I've encountered working as a clinician and now working in a coaching role with teams who are writing goals for AAC. We want to make sure we're writing goals that facilitate communication and not a compliance routine. We want success, and in order to do that, we need to build lots of positive associations with communication and with language. We can build success by having a baseline and knowing what it is that the person cares to communicate about. So just like this slide says, we want to focus on the interests and the abilities of our clients and our students. This came up during a recent consultation I had with a school team that was a bit stuck getting their student to use his device at school. And they had IEP goals that the student would request a break using his device. But the trouble was that at home, his parents were reporting that he requested breaks consistently with minimal prompting, and in return, he was able to go to a quiet space inside. He had this built a fort in his room. So at school, he was needing maximum assistance to request his break, and this wasn't what parents were seeing at home. So there was this inconsistency. And when I asked what the break options were for the student at school, the team shared some really lovely options like a movement jumping break, going for a walk, or seated at his desk with a fidget. In talking with parents, though, it turns out that this particular student needed to get away from visual and auditory distractions to help with regulation, and he really preferred time alone in a dark, quiet space for his break. So once we changed the break options to options that were really motivating for the student was much more willing to attend to models for breaks at school and to use the device to initiate himself. It sounds really simple, but these are small pieces that can make big differences for engagement. And all of these things can impact success and are definitely considerations we want to think about as we're writing our goals. So we need to think about communication partner preference. Is there someone that the student particularly enjoys working or talking with? The environment, so are there noises or smells or any of these things that are aversive to them around? Are they feeling embarrassed by certain activities or certain things that we're asking of them? And do they have a preference of food or toys? Maybe what's the most popular might not be the case for some. So just keeping in mind that all of our clients are unique. So we have this GPS analogy to help us understand the goal framework. To obtain directions on our GPS, we need not only the destination, which would be the goal, but we also need to know where we're starting from. And this is the solid baseline. That's going to help us know how we'll get there. I think many times we think that the goal is the final destination, but I think we should consider, are there other benchmarks that show progress towards the destination along the way? And think about the directions that get you to the final destination as your treatment plan. We might use different terminology. I know there's goals, objectives, benchmarks. It changes based on the setting that you practice in. But today, we don't want to get lost in the details and the technicalities. We want to help you figure out how to determine and reach your desired result. This is from Corsten Fossenberry. The underlying intention of the goal is to identify what is expected to change as a result of this intervention. So we want to keep that in mind as we go. Reviewing AAC and goal writing literature and pulling from personal experience as SLPs and consultants, we selected 3 important frameworks to use to create an AAC goal worksheet. These include the communicative competencies, goal attainment scaling, and SMART terminology. So this is our AAC goal framework sheet, and that is in page 4 of your handout. Each of those 3 elements that were in the funnel are incorporated into the development of this form. Let's spend time briefly discussing what each of them is and how you could use them. So let's start at the top with the 4 communicative competencies. Communicative competence is defined as the ability to communicate functionally in natural environments and to meet daily communication needs. It can be divided into 4 interrelated domains or areas, and these are linguistic competency, operational competency, social competency, and strategic competency. We'll go through each of these in more depth as we progress during the training, but just as a quick overview, linguistic competency is the ability to use and understand language. Operational competency refers to the technical skills to use an AAC system. Social competency is the ability to use and understand the rules of interaction. And strategic competency relates to the use of compensatory strategies to overcome obstacles and prevent and repair communication breakdowns. So if you have sufficient language skills, you know how to use the AAC system, you have strategies to use when things don't work, and you understand the rules of interaction, you are well on your way to being a competent and successful communicator. Therefore, when you write goals, it's really important that you consider each of these areas for the person using AAC. You can identify areas of weakness and skills that need to be taught or improved to make your client a more competent communicator. Next up, this is the inclusion of the goal attainment scale, the GAS. So this is your tool to help define and organize your path. It was originally developed by Kiersick and Sherman as a way to measure behavioral change in the mental health field. It has since grown in popularity in other fields like geriatrics and early intervention and occupational therapy, and more recently, speech-language therapy as it relates to people who use AAC. Basically, it's a way to measure progress toward behavioral goals and objectives where traditional outcome criteria like trials or percentages doesn't clearly capture progress. And it also helps to measure and compare progress across goals. So here we have the goal attainment scaling. Level 1 is our baseline. We want to think about stimulability and where do they have some emerging skills that can make the goal we're about to write attainable. And level 3 is our expected destination, given the timeline and setting you're working in. So this could either be an IEP year, it could be 10 approved insurance visits if you're in an outpatient clinic setting, or it could be a month of rehab, for example. And then level 5 is the long-term hope for the goal. Keep in mind here that this doesn't necessarily equate to 100% accuracy. It's usually going to be the level 3 goal in a more generalized context. So you're thinking about where are we today, where do we want to be in the future, and how are we going to get there? And I think this quote from Corsten fits really nicely with our rationale for using this goal attainment scale, that expectations will be more attainable and less frustrating when the individual is viewed based on true ability rather than on unrealistic expectations. Acknowledging and being guided by an individual's interests and abilities is crucial when developing a communication system. So their interests and their abilities are always driving what we're doing. The value of the goal attainment scale for practitioners in AAC is that it measures client progress in functional situations and communicative exchanges that can't otherwise be measured by percentages and trials. One of the first things that stood out to us about the goal attainment scale was the rubric format, that it's not an all or nothing setup. It challenges the goal writer to consider each level and how progress for each skill would be best tiered. Furthermore, as Linda Burkhart and Gail Porter pointed out, often communication, and especially this is true with social communication, is measured by appropriateness and not necessarily quantity. So appropriateness is dependent on the interaction with communication partners in specific contexts. The final element of the goal framework is the SMART terminology. This is purposefully positioned at the bottom of the form, as the initial focus is on getting the content of the goals down. And then the SMART framework helps us fine-tune our writing and ensures that we've included all the necessary components to be considered quality goals and objectives. Like the goal attainment scale, the SMART framework is not unique to AAC. It's been used widespread, with the individual letters often taking on different meanings depending on which field is using it. In this context, we want to make sure our goals and objectives are specific or clear such that someone else, including the person using AAC, can easily understand it. We want them to be measurable so we can show progress and know when we've achieved the desired outcome. Agreed upon so we're sure to support the desires of the whole team especially that of the person who uses AAC and their family. We want them to be realistic or relevant. Realistic given the knowledge, time, age, and availability of our resources, or relevant for the person both today and tomorrow. And then we need to make sure they're time-based so that we know how much time we have to work towards it. I'm going to introduce you to our case study for the day, which we're going to use to practice writing and brainstorming goals and objectives using this form. So meet Matthew. This is on page 5 of your handout if you'd like to refer to those notes. He is a 6-year-old boy with autism. His fine motor, vision, and hearing are within normal limits, but he does not like loud noises. He got a NovaChat 8 about 2 months ago, and now he's using the WordPower 60 basic vocabulary file. And he uses some signs and some words on his device to communicate. Now, this is really important to know and to understand. What motivates Matthew? What does he like to do? What might he want to control or communicate about? We also might want to know the people he likes to communicate with most. So we'll be keeping these in mind as we write his goals. What we'll do now is first talk about how and why we select targets for each competency. And second, we'll talk about how to use the AAC goal framework to complete the chart. Third, we'll finish up with a SMART check for our goals. So let's start us off with linguistic competency. Notice the Venn diagram here on the left. As we go along, we'll discuss how the communicative competencies can overlap. What is linguistic competence? It's our ability to use language expressively and to understand the meaning of language receptively. It involves a spectrum of skills, starting with basic functional communication, all the way up to complex reading and writing skills. To be linguistically competent looks different for different people. If you're an SLP, you already have a good understanding of what it means to have receptive and expressive language skills that are developmentally on track. Basically, linguistic competence refers to how well we understand and use language. I'm going to walk you through the rationale for how we chose these 2 linguistic objectives here. And then next, we'll go through some ways to measure linguistic competence to obtain and measure baseline and progress. And then we'll plug these 2 objectives into the goal attainment scale so that you can get an idea of how to use the AAC goal framework we created. So our 2 objectives are to increase the use of prepositions and to increase his ability to state likes and dislikes. So Kim is going to launch our 3rd poll here. What are your go-tos for determining language goals for your clients? There's no wrong answer here. I'm curious to hear if you use formal standardized tests like the PLS or the SELF, or if you use developmental milestone checklists like Brown stages, if you use language samples, or if it's something else. And if it's something else, go ahead and type it into the chat window for us there. All right, it looks like we've got a really nice mix here. So some people use formal standardized tests, some people use developmental milestone checklists, and some people use language samples. Great, thanks for sharing that. One of the best resources you can use to determine target areas to work on is typical language development, right? We know this as SLPs. There are a lot of great available tools and charts you can use to help make sense of language development, such as the functions of communication, core vocabulary, and Brown stages of development and grammar. So we're going to take a look at each. Brown stages of development and grammar have been used to develop many other frameworks. It includes pragmatic, semantic, morphology, and syntactic expectations based on developmental language stages, from single word productions, progressing to multi-word utterances. And if you think back to your days in school, you might remember learning about this or seeing a chart like this. There's a few tools that use Brown stages in a more user-friendly format. There we go. So we have a free version of Brown's stages from Linguisystems called Guide to Communication Milestones. This includes the Brown stages as well as other charts of early language acquisition. And I like it because it's really user-friendly. Kim is going to post a link in the chat window where you can obtain a free copy, but there's also a link in your handout packet. I believe it's on page 6. Then we have a profile. It's to provide a tool that enables a clinician to perform a simple, rapid evaluation of the language performance of a client using an SGD. And this is called the Quad Communication Profile. It's a set of 4 checklists that focus on the areas of vocabulary, the words an individual uses to build sentences, morphology, the way words change within a sentence, syntax, the order of words in a sentence, and function, what the purpose of a sentence is or why we communicate, which is like our communicative intent. And Kim's also going to post the link for the free Quad profile, but again, it's also in your handout should be on page 6. So when using these developmental frameworks, it's important to keep in mind that language acquisition theories were developed to account for language learning under typical circumstances. And language learning for people who use AAC is usually different. To name a few reasons why, there's often reduced opportunities overall to express themselves, difficulty with initiation and controlling interactions, and generally, someone else has control over the vocabulary supplied. And this, unfortunately, can be less robust than they might need. Here is another tool, the Functions of Communication by Janice Light. The functions of communication are the reasons or the why behind why we communicate. Janice Light proposed 4 general categories of communicative functions: communicating wants and needs, exchanging information, developing social closeness, and fulfilling social etiquette. I wonder if we think about which function makes up the majority of the reason why most people communicate. Does anybody have a guess? You can type it into the chat window if you're feeling like guessing. Why do we as adults communicate? In our AAC implementation toolkit training, we dive more deeply into this, but it is social closeness. So yeah, in our AAC implementation toolkit training, I highly recommend it if you want to dive deeper into these functions of communication. But for early communicators, this is also a really good place to start. So you can write goals that will show an increase in the number of communicative functions expressed and used appropriately by the child. This is also part of the AAC implementation toolkit training that Saltillo offers, and it lists different functions of communication in more detail. It's also in your handout packet on page 7, and it can serve as a place to start when you're thinking about the different functions. The first column is communicating wants and needs, and this goes beyond requesting food, drinks, and toys. It includes things like requesting attention, requesting activities, requesting permission, or directing action. And the next main area is exchanging information. And this includes things like asking and answering questions, or labeling, sharing objects, or giving an opinion. And then the last main area is social closeness and etiquette. Social closeness means those things that you typically do with someone who's close to you, like family or friends. And this could be things like expressing feelings, commenting, taking turns, or gossiping. Social etiquette are those things that you do according to social norms. So this can include things like greetings or saying please and thank you. There are other tools that look at functions of communication differently. Here's one example, the quad profile, and it divides language functions based on 7 types of functions. The other thing we wanted to draw attention to as a way to measure linguistic competence is core vocabulary. And as you know, core vocabulary are those words that make up the majority of what we say. So between 250 and 400 words that make up 80% of what we say. And what we know about core vocabulary is that it allows for flexibility and novel generation. It's useful across contexts, and it can be combined to increase semantic and syntactic complexity. It also allows for expression of a variety of different communicative functions and is consistent. It also overlaps with core vocabulary and literacy, right? So core vocabulary is a great place to start. There are lots of different core vocabulary lists available and resources for this. In your handout, this is on page 8 and 9, you have a collection of early core words. But again, there's lots more resources for these. This is just one option so that you can have it for reference. So how did we decide on these 2 objectives for Matthew? Well, we took a few of the resources we had available to us and we thought about his language. When I started thinking about Matthew's core vocabulary, I wasn't really sure which core words he was currently using. So I generated an inventory of all of his language, whether it was signed, a word approximation, or generated using his Nova chat. And this was based on parent and teacher report and observation. Now, with this word inventory, I can compare this to the early language word lists and then reflect on what he has and what he doesn't have in his language use. My next question is, what words might be appropriate to target next based on what I know about Matthew? What would be most functional and motivating for him to learn to use? So simply highlighting the words on the core lists that Matthew uses allows me to see where some target vocabulary might be. I decided I wanted to teach him how to use some prepositions. Prepositions are words used and understood early in language development, and they're not currently in his repertoire. And we could easily think of some structured play activities that we could incorporate prepositions, and that would be something fun and motivating for Matthew. We also took an inventory of his functions of communication. And when we think about Matthew, we know that he communicates to request objects. He says things like, I want iPad, I want to eat, I want to drink. We know he directs preferred actions using go and stop. We know he can label colors, and we know he can deny with no. That's something we see a lot, right? And then we ask ourselves, what might be appropriate to strengthen or target next? Or asked another way, what will make the most difference for Matthew? So this is where you realize there are so many things we can work on, and it's tricky. It can be tricky to decide what to work on next. So because his team expressed concern with how he currently shuts down when he doesn't like something, we decided to work on stating his opinion, starting at an introductory level of like and don't like, so he can start to do more with his language and self-advocate in that way. We already know that he has things he has strong preferences for and against, like loud noises, so we can use this information when we're creating his goal. So once you know what you want to work on, you're ready to brainstorm what that might look like as an objective or a goal and how we can get there. We're going to walk through writing one of these 2 objectives. In your handout, you have a completed form for linguistic competency. So don't worry about getting every word down. This is really more about the process and the thinking through. So you already have this fully completed on page 11 of your handout. The first thing we're going to do is fill in Matthew's name and check the competency at the top. We'll start with linguistic. Our overarching goal is to increase or improve Matthew's linguistic competency. Now, we can write a goal or objective to increase use of prepositions. I provided some examples that I think would be appropriate based on those core word lists. These also happen to be all on the home page of his WordPower 60 basic vocabulary, which will allow him for quicker access and hopefully better success in using these new vocabulary words. Next, using the information discussed, we can describe his baseline. What can Matthew do now as it relates to core vocabulary, or more specifically, to prepositions? So we can write down that Matthew expresses, either via sign, verbalization, or with his NovaChat, 18 core words, but he does not express any prepositions yet. I'm going to write this for Matthew, but if you have a student with whom you're working, you're welcome to modify what I do here to better fit your student. But based on the baseline info and Matthew's learning style, we're going to decide what can be expected to be achieved during the IEP year. So Matthew will use 6 target prepositions to direct action during structured play activities with minimal support. That's our level 3. And then we can go to level 2. So we need to write a step that would be in between where he is now at his baseline and where he's expected to go at the level 3. There's not one right way to do this. The way you write it will highly depend on your experience and the client you're working with and the setting in which you're working. But one option could be that you'll say that Matthew will use 6 target prepositions to direct action during structured play given moderate support. So we've changed the level of support here in between the baseline and the level 3 goal. Now we're going to move to level 4. So if Matthew were to meet his goal at level 3, what would you want him to do next? Here's one option. We could say that Matthew will use 6 target prepositions during less structured activities. And then finally, going to level 5, we want to think about what would be functional for Matthew long term. You'll notice we're not necessarily filling this out in a linear way from level 1 up to level 5 or vice versa. It makes sense to start with the baseline and then determine the expected goal for the time period. But in some cases, after determining the baseline, it might make more sense to write out the best expected level 5 goal before determining that intermediate goal. Really, I encourage you to go in the order that flows best for you and your thought process. There's no right or wrong way to fill this out. Ooh, I love that question. Can you provide an example of minimal support versus moderate support? It is such a fantastic question. If you don't mind, Linda, I'm going to put it on hold for now because we are certainly going to revisit that. Part of the problem is that minimal or moderate support is pretty vague, right? I'm not sure exactly what we're talking about there. So really nice job for catching that. We will come back to that. For now, we're just kind of getting our general thoughts down, but I love where your head is going. So level 5, we have that Matthew will use 6 target prepositions spontaneously when appropriate. And then there you have it. We have completed one objective with benchmarks for a functional skill for Matthew as it relates to his linguistic abilities. If you're feeling overwhelmed at all, the areas that you really need to do are the objective, the baseline, and the level 3. And once you have those, you'll be able to fill in the other 3 levels by adding or changing things like the level of support, the number of opportunities or trials, the number of communication partners, or the number of environments. You could change things like percentage or frequency or duration, things like that. So there's lots of options. And then, so you'd return to your linguistic goal sheet and you would do the same process for the second objective. For the sake of time, we're not going to walk through that second objective, but instead you have a completed version of the form in your handout, and we'll highlight a few of the levels here together. So doing the same thing for the second objective, first, at the top, you would write the objective to increase the ability to state his likes and dislikes. Then we would go to the level 1 baseline. Matthew says no when asked, do you want? And he plugs his ears or rocks when experiencing things he doesn't like. That's his performance right now. And then we can go to level 3, which is our goal for the timeline that we have. And Matthew will express like to indicate satisfaction for 10 known preferred items or activities when asked his opinion. So like a what do you think question. And then you could continue to think through the other 2 levels. And again, those levels help to show the subtle progress, the intermediate changes in between the larger goals. And when we're finished, we now would have a plan to help Matthew start to state his opinion related to likes and dislikes of items and activities. So a few questions here. You might want to think about, how could I translate these goals into an IEP or to the format that I'm currently using in my clinic or whatever setting I'm working within? Also thinking about, how do I help ensure Matthew can reach these objectives? And what will working on these objectives actually look like in therapy? First up, let's talk about translating it into another format. How might I incorporate this brainstorming form into what I'm currently doing in my practice? One option is to attach it and treat it like a rubric. So the goals and objectives would be included by referencing the rubric. You can also take the information and translate it into whatever format you need to for your IEP or your clinic report. So for example, using terms like baseline or present level of performance instead of using words like level 1 on the goal attainment scale. Or your goal instead of using terms like level 3 on the goal attainment scale, which is what is expected for the time period you're working within. So you could also use the goal form and attach it to the IEP or clinical documentation and reference that form. For example, for your baseline, you could simply indicate see level 1 on the AAC goal framework attached. So when we write goals, we really need to think about not only the goals and the skills of the individual using the device, but also those who will be working with the individual. So for this first objective, using prepositions, the communication partner may need to know where the words are in the vocabulary. And if they don't know, they can learn where they are using a word finder feature to help locate those words. And since the objective includes given aided language input, the communication partner needs to know what that includes. And going back to the question earlier, minimal or moderate support, they need to know what that means. So for the second objective, the communication partner needs to know the word like, where the word like is in the vocabulary, and they need to know things that Matthew likes and things he doesn't like. So how can we help communication partners do this? Here's one option. It's a tool for other communication partners. So people like paraprofessionals or nursing aides, teachers or parents. And this is on page 12 of your handout. This cue card is to help make sure everyone knows what the prompts should look like for cueing and then fading the cues for certain skills. So your team might have something else that helps you to relay the nuances of prompting and fading prompts. And if not, if you need some ideas, feel free to use this one. So I know some teams, for example, I've seen teams use a video clip to show what the therapeutic interaction can look like. Or with ABA therapy, clinicians might write out procedures for each goal so that it's crystal clear how to target each skill and what the support looks like. In this specific example, the cue card reads how to set up the activity. So first you set the ball activity in a familiar location, you place the ball in, you ask Matthew, where's the ball? And then it shows you how to cue and prompt from there. Here's your wait time, wait 5 seconds. And then it shows you what to do if he selects the preposition or if he doesn't. What do you do to help cue him from there? So this is just one option that you can use with your team. Any questions so far from that point forward? We'll have time for questions at the end too, but it's a good stopping point to check in. All right, we'll keep cruising along. It's time for operational competency. So you can find this on page 13 of your handout packet. The goal is for the person who uses AAC to operate their system independently. And we want to teach people who use AAC the mechanics of their technology so that they can build independence and self-advocacy skills. For Matthew, we chose speak the message by using the SMART period and carry his device himself. Now, we'll talk about the rationale for choosing these two objectives before we take a look at the goal framework. Unlike linguistic skills, there aren't any formal assessments or checklists for what operational skills are required. In your handout, you have one brainstorming tool. This is what we'll use today. We're going to provide a few examples of skills and then walk you through writing one operational objective for Matthew. The brainstorming tool is not a comprehensive list, and it's not in a hierarchy of any form. These are just some ideas to be considered on an individual basis. So Kim is going to launch our 4th poll here. I'd love to hear if you have any goals already written to specifically address operational skills for your students or the clients that you're working with. It looks like the majority of people don't at this point, don't have goals specifically written to address operational skills. Okay, let's see, let's talk more about them and see how you're feeling at the end. So with the example of charging a device, here's a few ways Matthew or someone could display operational competence here. He could select the battery status button. Matthew could also use a pre-programmed message on his device page that is within the social page to tell someone when his device needs to be charged. So he could self-advocate that way. Another way Matthew or someone could exhibit operational competence is simply by taking his device to a charging station at the end of the day. Another example could be competence in utilizing a dynamic display. So for example, knowing the home button takes you back to the home screen, or the lock button will keep you on the current page instead of bouncing back home, or that the arrow takes you to another page of similar vocabulary. Here are 3 additional examples. So using the SMART period to speak your message, or how to clear using the X button in the speech display, or using the clear button. Just some different options for you. When we talk about access, we really are talking about how the person uses and makes selections on the device. And there's direct selection with your finger, head tracking using our chat fusion with chat point, and switch scanning. So depending on the access method being used, you'll likely have different skills to target here. Increasing speed may be related to how quickly someone can put 2 words together, and it can also be achieved by decreasing acceptance time, dwell time, or introducing an auditory prompt. Those are all features on our devices. Here are some examples of operational skills to target in terms of access. So you could target how to wake up or turn on your device, how to use the kickstand so you can see the vocabulary on the screen, or educating communication partners on positioning or mounting for ease of access. If you're looking for a few resources to help determine possible steps or processes involved in developing skills related to access, both of these break down a hierarchy. If access isn't in place, it trumps the other competencies in terms of skills that might need to be targeted. So this is really important. To figure out what operational skills to target for Matthew, we went through this brainstorming tool and highlighted the things he was doing and made comments about his skill level. So for example, we checked that he could adjust the volume button, but noted in the comments that he uses it but doesn't adjust it appropriately. And then based on what he can do, we selected 2 operational skills to target. Using the SMART period to speak the message is something that's completely new for Matthew, but based on the fact that he's putting 2 to 3 words together, we want to make sure he's speaking his message as a whole to his communication partners. And our second objective is carrying the device. This is an emerging skill, but he's highly dependent on prompts to do this at this point. So we want to increase independence and frequency here. So using the goal framework, we're going to brainstorm through these objectives to help Matthew increase his independence to operate the device. So we start with writing Matthew's name and checking operational. And again, this is on page 16 and 17 on your handout, so no worries about getting every word down here. We are going to write in the objective for speaking the message in the speech display bar by using the SMART period. He needs to be able to string words in his utterance together so that his communication partners can hear his message. Now we'll go to his baseline and we'll think about what Matthew can do currently. Matthew can select 2 to 3 words in a sequence, like play iPad, but he does not speak the entire message as a whole yet. And then based on the baseline info and Matthew's learning style, we can decide what can be expected to be achieved during the IEP year. So that's here in level 3. Matthew will use the SMART period to speak his message of 2 or more words with no more than 1 visual prompt. And then we would write a step, level 2, in between where he is now at his baseline and where he is expected to go at level 3. And things you can change are, for example, targets or activities, support. So here's one option. We decided to go with that Matthew will use the SMART period to speak his message of 2 or more words with no more than 1 visual and 1 verbal prompt. We're going to jump to level 4. If Matthew met his goal at level 3, what are we expecting him to do next? And here we want Matthew to use the SMART period to speak his message of 2 or more words given expected wait time. So we're decreasing the support there. And then we go to level 5. What is your ultimate long-term goal for Matthew regarding use of the SMART period? Here we would say that Matthew will independently use the SMART period to speak his message of 2 or more words as appropriate. And there you go. You have your first objective ready to go for Matthew. And if we put the other objective about carrying his AAC device here, we now have 2 objectives ready to go to support his operational competence. And again, that's on page 17 of the handout, so you have it for your reference. Now we think about what skills might his communication partners need. Well, they need to know how to use the SMART period, and they need to know how to prompt. So again, we can use a cue card like you saw earlier. So it's a tool for your communication partners to know the procedures for how to prompt and support Matthew in these new skills. And that's on page 18 of your handout. A quick note about operational skills. They're not always listed as part of an IEP, but these are skills that are still part of, still can be part of your device plan towards communicative competence for your clients. And just a quick note, some funding sources look for these to make sure that the individual can complete them. All right, so we are coming to the end of the hour here. We have a couple minutes for questions. And I also wanted to encourage you all to check us out on Facebook if you're not following already. The posts from Saltillo are really wonderful, and they often highlight the implementation resources that we have on the chat corner of our website. You can search Saltillo brand on Facebook to find us there. And there's also a NovaChat group on Facebook that you can join. There's also a YouTube channel that has some really wonderful videos, tutorials, and recorded webinars. And of course, you can go to the saltillo.com website to learn more about finding the chat corner and looking at our recorded webinars. This is also the place that you can find your local representative. So you can go to saltillo.com and find your regional consultants for support if you have questions directly for them. Otherwise, I would be happy to answer your questions. My email is listed there on the screen, so feel free to reach out. And I'm going to stay on for an extra couple minutes just in case anybody has additional questions. We have part 2 of the webinar tomorrow, same time, so I hope you're able to join us. And we will definitely be talking more about the SMART framework tomorrow. So again, diving deeper into the question about the minimal, moderate, maximum support, and how to identify what exactly that means within your goal. So if you have more questions about that and want to check back with us tomorrow, I hope to see you there. Thanks, everybody.